In the depths of human suffering, there exists a moment when even the strongest faith can shatter like glass. Imagine a man so perfect that God himself bragged about him to Satan, yet so broken that he spoke words that would echo through eternity and change the very foundation of belief itself. Picture the most righteous person who ever lived, sitting in ashes, covered in painful sores, looking up at heaven with hatred instead of hope. What if the greatest test of faith in history had ended not with victory, but with the most devastating curse ever spoken against the divine? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Our story begins in the ancient land of Uz, where a man named Job lived a life so blessed that it seemed touched by heaven itself. Chapter 1. The Perfect Man. In the rolling hills of the ancient land of Uz, there lived a man whose very name meant persecuted. Yet persecution seemed the furthest thing from his reality. Job was not just wealthy, he was impossibly, divinely blessed. 7,000 sheep dotted his vast pastures like white clouds across green earth. 3,000 camels carried his goods across desert trade routes. 500 pairs of oxen plowed his endless fields, while 500 donkeys carried his grain to distant markets. But Job's greatest treasures were not counted in gold or livestock. 7 sons and 3 daughters filled his home with laughter and love. Each day, his children would feast together, moving from house to house in joyful celebration. And each morning, Job would rise before dawn to offer sacrifices for each of them, just in case they had sinned in their hearts during their festivities. The people of the East spoke his name with wonder. Travelers would journey for weeks just to seek his wisdom. Kings sent messengers asking for his counsel. Job feared God with perfect reverence and turned away from evil with complete dedication. He was not just good, he was flawless. In a world full of broken people, Job stood as proof that perfection was possible. Yet in the invisible realm above, where angels gather and destinies are decided, Job's perfect life was about to become the center of the most dangerous wager in cosmic history. Chapter 2. The Heavenly Wager. High above the earth, in the throne room of the Almighty, a meeting was taking place that would shake the very foundations of faith. One by one, the sons of God presented themselves before their Creator. Among them walked another figure, one whose very presence carried the chill of doubt and rebellion. Satan, the accuser, the one who questions every motive and doubts every good intention. God's voice thundered with pride as he spoke of Job. "Have you seen my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is perfect and good, a man who fears God and stays away from evil." The divine pride was unmistakable. Here was the Creator's masterpiece of human character. But Satan's response cut through the heavenly realm like a blade. "Of course Job serves you. Look how you have blessed him. You have put a protective wall around him, his family, and everything he owns. You have made him rich and successful in everything he does. But if you take away everything he has, he will curse you to your face." The challenge hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Could faith survive without blessing? Was Job's devotion real, or was it just clever self-interest? God accepted the wager with devastating confidence. "Very well. Everything Job has is in your power, but do not lay a hand on Job himself." As Satan departed with dark purpose, the stage was set for a test that would determine not just one man's fate, but the very nature of human devotion to the divine. Chapter 3. When Heaven Falls Silent. The morning started like any other in Job's blessed life. His servants tended the vast flocks. His children prepared for another day of celebration, and Job himself offered his daily prayers. But evil was racing toward him with supernatural speed, carrying messages that would destroy everything he held dear. The first messenger arrived gasping for breath, his clothes torn and his face white with terror. The Sabaeans attacked. They stole the oxen and donkeys and killed all the servants. I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Before Job could even process this devastating news, a second messenger stumbled forward with even worse tidings. Fire fell from heaven. It burned up all the sheep and servants. I alone escaped to bring you this news. The impossibility of it struck Job like a physical blow. Fire from heaven, his 7,000 sheep, gone in moments. But the nightmare was far from over. A third messenger brought word of Chaldean raiders who had swept down like locusts, taking all 3,000 camels and slaughtering every servant who tried to protect them. Job's vast wealth was evaporating like morning mist before the rising sun. Then came the final, crushing blow. The fourth messenger could barely speak through his tears. Your children were feasting in their oldest brother's house when a mighty wind swept in from the desert. The house collapsed, killing all of them. I am the only survivor. 10 children, gone. In a single moment, Job's laughter-filled home became a tomb of silence. Yet amazingly, incredibly, Job's response defied every expectation. He tore his clothes, shaved his head, and fell to the ground in worship, saying, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Chapter 4. The Moment of Choice. Satan was not finished. The first test had been failed spectacularly. Job's faith had not only survived, but had grown stronger through suffering. The accuser returned to God with fury and frustration burning in his dark heart. Skin for skin. A man will give everything he has to save his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will curse you to your face. God's permission came with the same terrifying confidence. He is in your hands, but spare his life. What followed was a torment beyond human description. Painful boils erupted across Job's entire body, from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. The sores burned like fire, itched beyond endurance, and oozed with infection that attracted flies and filled the air with the stench of rotting flesh. Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped at his sores as he sat among the ashes of his former life. His wealth was gone, his children were dead, his body was a mass of agony, and still he refused to curse God. Days passed in endless torment. Nights brought no relief, only the sound of his own groaning echoing in the darkness. Then his wife approached him, her own faith shattered by watching her husband's inexplicable suffering. Her words carried the weight of desperate love twisted into bitter rage. Are you still holding on to your perfect faith? Curse God and die. End this misery. Job looked up at her with eyes clouded by pain and exhaustion. For the first time since his trials began, he hesitated. The weight of absolute agony pressed down on him like a mountain. His perfect faith wavered on the edge of a cliff, and the abyss of despair yawned beneath him. This was the moment that would decide everything. But what if, in our story, the unthinkable happened? Chapter 5. The Curse That Shattered Heaven. In our alternate timeline, something broke inside Job's perfect heart. The cumulative weight of losing everything, his wealth, his children, his health, finally crushed his spirit completely. The pain was not just physical, it was the agony of feeling abandoned by the very God he had served so faithfully. With cracked lips and a voice raw from crying out in pain, Job raised his face toward heaven. "God!" he screamed, his voice carrying across the ash heap where he sat. "I curse you! I curse your name! You have destroyed an innocent man for no reason. You are not just, you are cruel. You are not loving. You are evil. I wish I had never been born to know your false promises." The words that left Job's mouth did not just echo across the earth. They tore through the fabric of heaven itself. In the divine throne room, God's face reflected something that had never been seen before: the pain of ultimate betrayal. The perfect man, the crown jewel of creation, had not just lost faith, he had declared war against his creator. Satan's laughter rang through the heavenly realm with victorious malice. Every doubt he had ever whispered about human nature was now proven true. If Job, perfect, blameless Job, could curse God, then every human was capable of the same betrayal. The accuser had won the ultimate victory. But this was more than just one man's fall from grace. Job's curse sent shockwaves through the very foundation of divine-human relationship. If the most righteous person who ever lived could not maintain faith through suffering, what hope was there for anyone else? The curse that left Job's lips in a moment of unbearable pain would echo through history, changing everything that came after. Chapter 6: The Divine Domino Effect. Job's curse created theological chaos that spread like wildfire through the ancient world. Religious leaders who had pointed to Job as proof that good people are rewarded and faithful people are protected suddenly found their entire worldview crumbling. If Job could break, if perfect faith could shatter, then what was the point of righteousness at all? In temples across the ancient Near East, priests struggled to explain to their followers why they should continue serving gods who might abandon them in their darkest hour. The story of Job's curse traveled along trade routes and pilgrim paths, carrying doubt like a plague that infected every conversation about divine justice and human suffering. Other righteous figures throughout history began to question their own experiences. Abraham, who had been willing to sacrifice Isaac, wondered if his obedience had been foolish rather than faithful. Moses, who had led Israel through the wilderness, questioned whether his dedication had been worth the cost. David, despite his royal glory, looked at his own struggles with new eyes, wondering if even his victories were meaningless in the face of potential divine abandonment. The concept of unconditional faith, the idea that humans could love God regardless of circumstances, was proven impossible by Job's failure. Religious communities that had built their entire identity around unwavering devotion found themselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Ancient philosophers seized upon Job's curse as evidence for their arguments about the cruel indifference of the universe. If even the perfect man could not maintain his faith, then perhaps faith itself was nothing more than a beautiful illusion that crumbled under the weight of reality. The theological earthquake that began with Job's broken cry would reshape human understanding of suffering, divine justice, and the very possibility of authentic relationship between heaven and earth. Chapter 7: Abraham's Altered Legacy. The father of faith himself felt the aftershocks of Job's curse echo backward through time. Abraham, who had earned his place in history by his willingness to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, now faced troubling questions about the true nature of his obedience. Had he been faithful, Or had he simply been afraid to disobey? Was his willingness to kill his son really evidence of perfect trust, or just the desperate act of a man terrified of divine punishment? The story of Isaac's binding took on darker meaning when viewed through the lens of Job's failure. Abraham's raised knife, which had once been seen as the ultimate symbol of faith, now seemed like evidence of human weakness rather than strength. If Job could curse God after a lifetime of perfect obedience, what guarantee was there that Abraham's faith was any more reliable? Isaac himself, now knowing that even perfect righteousness could lead to divine abandonment, questioned whether his father's near sacrifice had been worth celebrating. The ram caught in the thicket, which had once seemed like proof of God's provision, now appeared to be nothing more than a temporary reprieve in a cosmic game where the rules could change without warning. The Abrahamic covenant, the promise that through Abraham all nations would be blessed, faced new scrutiny. If human faithfulness could not be trusted even in perfect individuals like Job, how could any covenant between God and humanity be considered reliable? The chosen people began to wonder if their special status was built on nothing more substantial than shifting sand. Religious communities that traced their lineage back to Abraham found themselves grappling with uncomfortable questions about inherited faith, chosen status, and divine promises. Job's curse had not just destroyed one man's relationship with God, it had called into question the very foundation of monotheistic religion itself. Chapter 8: Moses and the Fragile Covenant. The great lawgiver faced his own crisis of confidence as Job's curse reverberated through the understanding of divine-human relationships. Moses, who had spoken with God face to face and received the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai, now questioned whether even direct divine communication could guarantee lasting faith. If Job, who was perfect in his observance of divine will, could ultimately curse God, what did this mean for a people called to follow hundreds of detailed commandments? The golden calf incident at the base of Sinai took on new and troubling significance. What Moses had once seen as a temporary lapse in faith by a weak and frightened people now appeared to be evidence of an inevitable human condition. Job's curse suggested that all humans, regardless of their initial faithfulness, carried within them the seeds of rebellion against the divine. The wilderness wanderings became less about preparing a generation to enter the promised land, and more about managing the reality that even the most faithful people would eventually fail their God. The laws given at Sinai were reframed not as expectations for righteous living, but as damage control for creatures inherently incapable of maintaining perfect faith. The covenant itself required revision. Instead of being a relationship based on mutual faithfulness, it became an arrangement where divine mercy would be necessary to compensate for inevitable human failure. The sacrificial system took on greater importance, not as a way to maintain fellowship with God, but as a constant acknowledgement that fellowship would be repeatedly broken and would need constant repair. Moses' own relationship with God became more tentative. Even his moments of anger, striking the rock instead of speaking to it, were now seen not as isolated incidents of human weakness, but as evidence of the universal truth that Job's curse had revealed. Perfect faith was impossible for any human being. Chapter 9: David's Songs of Doubt. The sweet psalmist of Israel found his harp strings vibrating with different melodies when Job's curse became part of his theological understanding. David, who had penned songs of absolute trust in divine protection and unfailing love, now wrote with the knowledge that even perfect faith could shatter under sufficient pressure. His psalms began to carry new undertones of uncertainty and fear. Where once David had written, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he now added verses acknowledging that even shepherds sometimes abandon their flocks. His songs of praise became tempered with recognition that human devotion, no matter how sincere, might not survive the kind of testing that Job had endured. The royal theology that surrounded David's kingship changed fundamentally. The promise that his dynasty would endure forever was now understood to depend entirely on divine mercy rather than human faithfulness. David's own struggles with sin, his adultery with Bathsheba, his murder of Uriah, were no longer seen as temporary lapses by an otherwise faithful king, but as evidence of the universal human condition that Job's curse had revealed. David's psalms of lament took on greater intensity and honesty. He wrote more frequently about feeling abandoned by God, about the apparent success of the wicked, and about the seeming futility of righteousness. The messianic promises woven throughout his songs became less about human achievement and more about divine intervention being necessary to accomplish what humans clearly could not do on their own. Even David's moments of greatest triumph, his victory over Goliath, his military conquests, his establishment of Jerusalem as the holy city, were now viewed through the lens of temporary divine favor rather than evidence of lasting divine approval. Job's curse had taught everyone, even kings, that no amount of past faithfulness could guarantee future divine protection. Chapter 10. Solomon's Wisdom, Reconsidered. The wisest man who ever lived found his understanding of divine justice fundamentally altered by the reality of Job's ultimate failure. Solomon, whose wisdom was legendary throughout the ancient world, now faced the impossible task of reconciling his knowledge of divine goodness with the evidence that even perfect righteousness offered no protection against suffering or abandonment. The book of Ecclesiastes, already pessimistic about human achievement and the meaning of life under the sun, took on even deeper tones of futility. Solomon's famous words, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," now carried the additional weight of knowing that even perfect faith was ultimately meaningless. If Job's righteousness had not protected him, then what value was there in pursuing wisdom, wealth, or any other human achievement? The Proverbs required extensive revision. Sayings that had once confidently connected righteous living with divine blessing now came with unspoken disclaimers. Trust in the Lord with all your heart was followed by the silent acknowledgement that even perfect trust might not prevent divine abandonment. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom was tempered by the knowledge that even perfect fear of the Lord had not protected Job from cursing God. The temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem became not just a house of worship, but a monument to the fragility of human faith. The dedication prayers included new acknowledgments of human weakness and requests for divine patience with inevitable human failure. The very architecture seemed to reflect a more humble understanding of the divine-human relationship. When the Queen of Sheba came to test Solomon's wisdom, she found a king whose greatest insights were about the limitations of human wisdom rather than its power. His answers to her questions carried the weight of knowing that even the wisest person could not guarantee their own continued faithfulness to God. Chapter 11. The Apocryphal Alternative. In hidden libraries and secret scriptoriums, alternative texts began to emerge as religious communities struggled to deal with the implications of Job's curse. The Testament of Job, written by scholars who refused to accept that perfect faith could fail, offered radically different endings to the familiar story. In these versions, Job's curse was revealed to be a test within a test, or the words were spoken by an impostor, or Job himself was restored to faith before his death. Gnostic communities, with their emphasis on hidden knowledge and the evil of material existence, embraced Job's curse as evidence that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was actually a cruel demiurge rather than the true divine being. They wrote texts claiming that Job's suffering revealed the malevolent nature of the Creator God, and that his curse was actually a moment of enlightenment rather than failure. Early Christian communities found themselves deeply divided over Job's relevance to their understanding of Christ. Some argued that Job's failure made Christ's perfect obedience even more remarkable and necessary. Others worried that if Job could curse God, perhaps even Christ's faithfulness was not guaranteed. Alternative gospels began to appear, telling stories of Jesus struggling with doubt and temptation in ways that the canonical gospels did not record. Jewish mystical traditions attempted to fix Job's story through elaborate interpretations involving hidden meanings, secret names of God, and complex numerological systems. Kabbalistic texts suggested that Job's curse had actually been part of a divine plan to reveal hidden aspects of God's nature that could only be understood through the experience of ultimate abandonment. Islamic scholars, writing about Ayub in the Quran, offered their own alternative version where the righteous servant never cursed Allah, but instead maintained perfect submission throughout his trials. These texts served as a counterpoint to the Jewish and Christian traditions that had to deal with Job's theological failure. Chapter 12. Eastern Echoes. The shock waves of Job's curse traveled far beyond the borders of monotheistic religion, affecting how Eastern traditions understood suffering, righteousness, and divine justice. Hindu scholars, with their complex understanding of karma and reincarnation, found in Job's story validation for their belief that all suffering was the result of actions in previous lives. Job's curse, they argued, simply revealed the inevitable consequence of hidden sins that Western religion was too simple to understand. Buddhist teachers used Job's failure as evidence for their core teaching that attachment leads to suffering. The Buddha himself was said to have commented that Job's mistake was not in cursing God, but in believing that perfect external righteousness could provide protection from the inherent suffering of existence. Job's curse became a teaching tool about the necessity of detachment from all outcomes, even divine favor. Zoroastrian dualism found strong support in Job's story. The cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman was perfectly illustrated by Job's experience. Good and evil were locked in eternal conflict, and even the most righteous person could become a casualty in that war. Job's curse was not failure, but honesty about the reality of cosmic warfare. Ancient Greek philosophical schools responded differently to Job's theological crisis. Stoics saw it as evidence for their teaching about accepting whatever fate brings. Epicureans used it to argue against taking the gods too seriously. Skeptics pointed to it as proof that no religious claims could be trusted. Platonists suggested that Job had mistaken the shadows on the cave wall for reality itself. These diverse responses to Job's curse created a rich tapestry of interpretation that showed how one man's broken faith had become a mirror reflecting the deepest concerns and beliefs of every religious and philosophical tradition that encountered his story. Chapter 13. The Christian Dilemma. Early Christians faced a devastating theological crisis as they grappled with the implications of Job's curse for their understanding of Christ's nature and mission. If Job, described as perfect and blameless, could ultimately curse God under pressure, what guarantee was there that Jesus Christ would maintain his faithfulness during his own trials? The very foundation of Christian salvation, Christ's perfect obedience unto death, seemed to rest on uncertain ground. The temptation narratives in the Gospels took on new significance when viewed through the lens of Job's failure. Satan's temptations of Jesus in the wilderness were no longer seen as easily defeated challenges, but as serious tests that had already proven capable of breaking perfect faith. Some Christian communities began to question whether Christ's victory over temptation was as certain as they had believed. Early church councils found themselves debating questions that would not have arisen without Job's curse. Was it possible for Christ to sin? If perfect humanity could curse God, was Jesus truly human, or was his faithfulness evidence of his purely divine nature? These debates led to the development of complex doctrines about Christ's two natures that might never have been necessary if Job's faith had not failed. The doctrine of human depravity took on deeper meaning when supported by Job's example. If even a perfect man could curse God, then clearly all humans were corrupted by sin in ways that made salvation by works impossible. This led to stronger emphasis on grace alone and faith alone as the means of salvation, since human faithfulness had been proven unreliable even in the best circumstances. Different Christian communities developed varying responses to Job's theological challenge. Some emphasized Christ's divinity to distinguish him from Job's humanity. Others focused on the necessity of divine grace to maintain faith. Still others questioned whether salvation could ever be considered secure if even perfect righteousness offered no guarantee of continued faithfulness. Chapter 14. Medieval Wrestling. Medieval scholars, inheriting centuries of theological struggle with Job's curse, developed entirely new approaches to understanding the relationship between human suffering and divine justice. Thomas Aquinas, the great synthesizer of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy, dedicated significant portions of his Summa Theologica to wrestling with the implications of perfect righteousness, leading to perfect failure. Medieval mystery plays, performed in town squares and cathedral courtyards, often depicted Job's curse as humanity's second fall, a moment when the possibility of perfect faith was proven to be an illusion. These dramatic presentations showed Job's progression from righteousness to rebellion, serving as warnings to audiences about the fragility of their own faith commitments. Monastic communities structured their entire way of life around the expectation of spiritual failure. The rule of St. Benedict was modified to include provisions for dealing with monks who lost faith entirely. Confession became not just a sacrament for dealing with individual sins, but a necessary practice for maintaining any relationship with God at all, since Job's example proved that even perfect people would eventually need forgiveness for ultimate failures of faith. The development of the doctrine of purgatory was heavily influenced by Job's story. If perfect people could curse God, then surely some kind of purification process after death was necessary for anyone who hoped to spend eternity in divine presence. Job's curse provided theological justification for the idea that even the best humans needed additional purification before they could be trusted in heaven. Medieval concepts of divine justice became more focused on mercy than on fairness. Since Job's experience proved that good people could suffer horribly and respond by cursing God, justice clearly could not be based on giving people what they deserved. Instead, medieval theology emphasized divine mercy as the only hope for any human being. Chapter 15. Reformation Fractures. The Protestant Reformation found powerful ammunition in Job's curse for their arguments about human depravity and the necessity of salvation by grace alone. Martin Luther pointed to Job's failure as conclusive evidence that no human being could maintain righteousness before God through their own efforts. If Job, who was perfect, ultimately cursed God, then clearly all humans were simul justus et peccator, simultaneously justified and sinner. John Calvin used Job's curse to support his doctrine of total depravity. Job's failure proved that human nature was so corrupted by sin that even perfect external righteousness could not prevent eventual rebellion against God. This made divine election and irresistible grace not just helpful doctrines, but absolutely necessary ones, since humans clearly could not maintain faith on their own. The Catholic Counter-Reformation responded by emphasizing the necessity of church authority and sacramental grace. Job's curse, they argued, proved that individual interpretation of Scripture and personal relationship with God were insufficient. Only through the mediation of the Church and the regular reception of sacramental grace could believers hope to avoid Job's fate. Different Protestant denominations developed varying interpretations of Job's theological significance. Lutherans emphasized the need for daily repentance and forgiveness. Reformed churches focused on the perseverance of the saints as a divine work rather than human achievement. Anabaptists questioned whether infant baptism could provide any real protection against the kind of faith failure that Job experienced. The emergence of different soteriological systems, different understandings of how salvation works, was directly influenced by the need to account for Job's curse. Every Christian tradition had to explain how their understanding of salvation could provide better hope than Job's perfect righteousness had offered him. Chapter 16. Scientific Revolution Responses. As the scientific revolution challenged traditional religious worldviews, Job's curse became a focal point for debates between faith and reason. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire used Job's story as evidence against divine providence and benevolent creator gods. If even perfect righteousness could not protect someone from arbitrary suffering that led to cursing God, then clearly the universe operated according to natural laws rather than divine intervention. Scientific materialism found in Job's curse support for their argument that religious faith was nothing more than a psychological coping mechanism that inevitably failed when confronted with reality. The failure of perfect faith proved that belief in divine protection was maladaptive, a comforting illusion that actually made people less prepared to deal with the harsh realities of natural existence. Deist interpretations of Job's curse fit perfectly with their concept of a distant, non-intervening God. Job's suffering and subsequent cursing of God proved that the Creator had indeed wound up the universe like a clock and then stepped back, leaving humans to deal with natural consequences without any expectation of divine rescue. The Industrial Revolution brought new forms of human suffering that seemed to echo Job's experience. Factory workers laboring in dangerous conditions, families torn apart by economic forces beyond their control, and entire communities destroyed by technological change all found resonance in Job's story. His curse became a rallying cry for those who felt abandoned by both God and society. The emergence of psychology as a scientific discipline offered new explanations for Job's curse that didn't require theological interpretation. Rather than seeing his words as a spiritual failure, psychologists began to understand them as a natural human response to trauma and overwhelming stress. This medical model of faith crisis competed directly with religious interpretations. Chapter 17: Modern Theodicy Wars. Contemporary theologians found themselves fighting battles on multiple fronts as they attempted to address Job's curse in light of modern experiences of massive suffering. Holocaust theology faced the terrible question of whether Job's precedent gave permission for victims of genocide to curse God. If perfect righteousness offered no protection from arbitrary suffering, what response was appropriate when entire peoples were systematically murdered? Liberation theology embraced Job's curse as justification for anger at oppressive systems and the God who seemed to permit them. Job's failure to maintain faith in the face of injustice was reframed not as personal weakness, but as appropriate rage at cosmic unfairness. His curse became a model for prophetic denunciation of both human and divine injustice. Prosperity gospel movements found themselves in direct conflict with Job's example. Their teaching that faith and righteousness would be rewarded with material blessing was contradicted by Job's experience of losing everything despite perfect faith. Some prosperity teachers attempted to reinterpret Job's story, while others simply ignored it as an outdated example from a different dispensation. Modern psychology's understanding of trauma and post-traumatic stress provided new frameworks for understanding faith crisis. Job's curse could be seen as a predictable psychological response to overwhelming loss, rather than a theological failure. This medicalization of doubt competed with traditional religious interpretations of faith and faithlessness. Contemporary disasters, pandemics, climate change, terrorism, economic collapse were increasingly viewed through the lens of Job's experience. His curse provided a vocabulary for expressing the anger and abandonment that many people felt when their faith was tested by global suffering that seemed both arbitrary and overwhelming. Chapter 18: Digital Age Doubts. The digital age brought unprecedented speed and reach to the spread of religious doubt, with Job's curse serving as a viral symbol for faith crisis in connected communities worldwide. Social media platforms became venues for sharing personal stories of faith failure that echoed Job's experience, creating virtual communities of people who felt abandoned by God in their darkest moments. Artificial intelligence systems, trained on vast databases of religious texts and human behavior, began to predict with disturbing accuracy the conditions under which individual believers would be likely to experience faith crisis similar to Job's. These algorithms could identify personal, social, and economic factors that correlated with religious abandonment, turning Job's curse into a data point in larger patterns of belief and unbelief. Global religious communities found themselves fracturing along new lines as different interpretations of Job's curse spread instantly across cultural and geographical boundaries. Traditional religious authorities lost control of the narrative as ordinary believers shared their own experiences of suffering and doubt, many explicitly connecting their stories to Job's ultimate failure. Modern forms of suffering, social media harassment, economic uncertainty, climate anxiety, pandemic isolation, created new contexts for understanding Job's experience. His curse resonated with people who felt overwhelmed by forces beyond their control and abandoned by both human communities and divine protection. The emergence of post-faith movements found inspiration in Job's curse as a model for honest acknowledgement of religious failure. Rather than seeing his curse as a moment of weakness to be overcome, these communities celebrated it as an authentic response to the reality that faith promises could not be kept in a world filled with arbitrary suffering. Chapter 19. The Soul's Dark Night. What does Job's curse teach us about the fundamental human condition? In our deepest suffering, when everything we have trusted is stripped away and every promise we believed has been broken, are we all just one catastrophic loss away from abandoning everything we hold sacred? Job's story forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that faith is not the unshakable foundation we want it to be, but a fragile human construct that crumbles under sufficient pressure. The psychology of belief reveals that humans need hope to survive, but Job's curse suggests that hope based on divine promises may be fundamentally unreliable. If perfect righteousness cannot guarantee divine protection, then what can any of us count on when our own trials come? His failure illuminates the gap between what we want to believe about God and what reality actually delivers. Yet perhaps Job's curse also reveals something profound about the nature of authentic faith. Maybe true faith can only exist when it includes the possibility of its own destruction. Maybe the only honest relationship with the divine is one that acknowledges the real possibility of abandonment and chooses love anyway. Job's curse might be not the end of faith, but the beginning of a more honest and therefore more genuine form of belief. The universal human experience of questioning faith during suffering suggests that Job's struggle is everyone's struggle. His curse gives voice to doubts that most people experience, but few have the courage to express. In breaking the silence about faith failure, Job's curse may actually provide a path toward more authentic relationship with both the divine and our own deepest truths. What if the real message of Job's curse is not that faith is impossible, but that impossible faith, the kind that never questions, never doubts, never fails, is not actually faith at all, but just another form of human pride disguised as righteousness? Chapter 20. The Unanswered Question. As our journey through Job's alternate history comes to an end, we find ourselves confronting a truth more terrifying than any curse ever spoken. The realization that all of human history balances on the knife's edge of individual choice. Job's decision to curse God in our timeline didn't just change his own story, it rewrote the entire narrative of divine human relationship throughout history. But if Job's curse could reshape reality itself, what other biblical what-ifs might be lurking in the shadows of sacred history? What if Abraham had refused to sacrifice Isaac? What if Moses had turned away from the burning bush? What if David had remained a humble shepherd? What if Mary had said no to the angel's announcement? Each of these moments represents a cosmic hinge point where a single human decision could have altered the course of everything that followed. Job's curse reveals that we are not passive observers of predetermined divine plans, but active participants whose choices carry weight that echoes through eternity. The most unsettling implication of Job's alternate history is that our own decisions, the ones we make in our darkest moments, when our faith is tested beyond its limits, might carry similar cosmic significance. Every time we choose doubt over trust, every moment we consider abandoning our beliefs, we stand at our own version of Job's crossroads. But perhaps the most chilling realization is this: if Job's curse changed everything that came after him, then somewhere in the multiverse of possibility, there might be timelines where other perfect servants of God made different choices. Realities where faith never failed, where righteousness was always rewarded, where the relationship between heaven and earth followed completely different rules. And if that's true, then maybe, just maybe, Job's curse was not the end of the story, but only the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying question about the nature of reality itself. But what if we told you that Job's curse was just the first domino to fall in a cosmic game, where every human choice reshapes the very fabric of existence?